Dynamite?
And yet still a more dignified defeat than most of the stuff this guy went through.
But yeah, after diving into the insanity that were the clouds of anarchy and despair, I figured we'd end the month of Halloween with the more playful side of the holiday. And that's not to say that this villain faction didn't have some scarier moments, because they were certainly there. However, I feel like that and other aspects of these baddies are kind of overlooked due to the divisive nature of the series they hail from. Thus, I just wanted to do a little video essay on not necessarily my overall personal favorite, but definitely one of my top tier villain factions of the Precure franchise.
And before anyone asks, yes, we also did consider Darkfall from Splash Star, but decided to go with these guys instead for a couple of reasons.
One, Splash Star itself has been gaining a lot of vindication as of late, so they don't really need that much more of a push. And two, I've never really heard that many fans speak ill of the villains of the show, more just the season they come from. If anything, they got some of the most praise when people discuss the show. Meanwhile, aside from one character, the rest of these villains don't really get that much praise, so I feel like correcting that, as I do think there's some hidden brilliance to at least a few of these baddies.
Moreover, if it gives me an opportunity to talk about one of my favorite Kamen Rider series ever, then I'll sure as hell take it.
We'll take a look at their motifs, analyze each of them, in particular one of them, and how much certain choices involving her affected the show, and consider whether or not they managed to successfully balance out their goofier sides with the more serious moments of the show to at least make for effective antagonists with a little more to them that we might have missed on our first go around of the series.
With that in mind, let's at least briefly give in to our more sinful desires as we take a look at the Selfish Kingdom from Dokidoki Precure.
Like a lot of things anime, the Selfish Kingdom was composed of characters each representing the 7 deadly sins of Roman Catholic theology. Originally, they were represented entirely just by the generals of this villain faction, but 2 of them were just kind of unceremoniously killed off screen, aka axed by the writers, and replaced by the king and his daughter. Nepotism at its finest, but yeah, again, this is a motif that has been used a lot in fiction in general.
Whether it be for divine comedies, homunculus, or as the personified form of some iron stakes that become frat girls. It's Umineko, don't question that.
In the case of Toei, it wasn't the first time they had used this motif. The museum and their associates from Kamen Rider Double represent each of the sins, with the big bad being the living embodiment of greed and its all-consuming nature. This would then carry right over into the next series, O's, with the whole villain faction just being called the Greed. Yet, in spite of that, they still did represent the other sins, with each of their more innate desires taking different forms. Interestingly enough, the final boss of that show represented what the Orthodox Christianity considered to be the 8th deadly sin, despair.
No, go back to your cage, we're done with you!
We bring this all up because the Selfish Kingdom very likely took more than a few cues from the Greed. We actually brought this up in our original reviews for Dokidoki, where we pointed out how the original writer of that show had previously worked under Oz's head writer. And looking back on it, there were actually a few more parallels that we could have made between the 2 properties that we can thankfully do now once we get a little deeper into this topic. But with all that in mind, let's do what Double always says and... While Double and O's were actually kind of subtle with how each of their characters represented the deadly sins, Dokidoki was a little more direct, with characters like Ira having a name that just straight up means wrath in Latin. As the first on-screen villain of the series, he was given the typical starter villain treatment. At first being treated somewhat like a threat before becoming one of the biggest jobbers of the show. This of course didn't sit well with him, on top of even his cohorts treating him like garbage, being one of the only 2 physical kids on their team, and he wasn't the boss's little girl. As a result, he would end up lashing out during a thunderstorm that would give him a convenient case of anime amnesia that somehow left no lasting trauma on his brain and yet turned him into almost a completely different person for most of that episode.
Or maybe this was a little closer to the real him all along.
I mean, don't get me wrong, Ira by his very nature will always be a stuck-up little brat, and yet by the end of the series, he became one of the more chill members of the Selfish Kingdom by even trying to convince Regina to give up on the conflict.
This might be a representation of how wrath can be one of the 7 deadly sins with one of the shortest shelf lives.
As while there can be exterior factors that prolong the other sins, mostly dopamine.
That's the chemical that gets released in your brain whenever you do something pleasurable, like eating, sex, and that's just nature, right? Like,
wrath, which is primarily driven by anger, can only last for so long from a physical standpoint. After all, anger is fueled by adrenaline, which, while relatively abundant in our younger adolescent years when hormones are out of control, as we get older, it slows down and we just don't feel like getting angry at everything anymore.
In short, learning how not to be pissy all the time is part of growing up.
Of course, this is on a case-by-case basis, but for a character who's designed to look like a preteen, even though he's implied to be a few centuries old, you could interpret Ira's arc as an allegory for how to overcome that awkward teenage angst phase, which a lot of the target audience, girl or boy, will have to deal with. When we realize and accept that our emotions and perceptions will never truly stay the same, we can really start to enjoy life to the fullest. Though, maybe don't enjoy it too much, because then we get into our next baddie. Mammo, who's actually based off of the sin of greed, might have the least story character compared to the rest of the original villain trio of the show. But, as time has gone by, her whole act has become a little more relevant. I mean, let's see, we have a middle-aged looking woman who tries to act below her apparent age, whilst trying to garner undeserved praise.
Now, imagine some networks of socializing where these sorts of people would be excessively pushed, especially if they're conventionally attractive, no matter how awful of a person they are.
Of course, I'm not saying all influencers are bad, being someone who at least regularly posts on YouTube, but I am against over-pushing them, especially upon the more impressionable members of their audience. This was kind of unintentionally highlighted when a few of her victims of the week were also attention-seeking girls, including a developing idol, and especially with her big spotlight episode where she became Cure Madame. Her quote-unquote heroism had essentially made her a viral sensation who was garnering a following, including a younger crowd, which quickly needed to be quelled when it was clear that she was being a selfish bitch and a horrible influence on said crowd. Mammo may not have gotten an arc like Ira or had the ups and downs like the next guy we're about to talk about, but it is interesting to see how her character has become a little more timeless after about a decade. Also, how the hell did I miss this Majinga reference originally?
私は鬼にでも悪魔にでもなりますわ。
でも俺は神様になれるわけないし、悪魔になんかなりたくない。
Bel, next to a certain someone, was arguably the villain with the biggest influence on the show's plot, being the one who technically created 3 very significant characters at once. Kind of ironic, considering Belphegor is the sloth demon who doesn't like to get off of his throne. Though, much like one of the aforementioned Umineko characters, that might just be him trying to make other people complacent in mitigating their desires. After all, he was successful in corrupting 1.5 plot significant characters, or is it technically 1 since they all come from the same place? Whatever. The point is that amongst all of the villains, even the final bosses, he was arguably the most outright evil, seeking not only to screw over the protagonist, but even his own cohorts and superiors, even killing 2 of them in the process. In other words, he was a less sympathetic Starscream, but yeah, as a result, he was probably the most intimidating villain at certain points in the show, because by the end, he did devolve into a bit of a laughingstock. Still, when he was number 1 in terms of plot significance, he was a knight of service by actually raising the threat levels when he did stuff like creating the Blood Rings and briefly trapping the Precure in Trump Kingdom. Sure, he was definitely no Joker, but his plans were solid, and just lacked a little foresight, likely due to his lazy nature, that made him want to take the easiest route to absolute power. Thus, even though he did become a bit of a joke by the end, he at least was able to briefly back up his words on more than one occasion, you know, as opposed to 0 so far. We'll just skim through Leva and Gula, who ultimately were more meant to be fodder for Bel's ambitions. The latter was a pretty nothing character, just the very embodiment of gluttony, and yet nowhere near as intimidating as his FMA counterpart. While the former, I think, was meant to be an Okama, which is kind of like Japan's version of drag queens, though more purposely playing up homosexual stereotypes, which in this case made him envious of Cure Ace's beauty, and yeah, let's just move on to the most popular character of the show. Regina, through her constant passes at Mana, clearly represented the sin of lust. A desire that can be defined as an intense longing for love that could also apply to just plain old familial love too. This of course left her caught between a rock and a hard place when choosing between her father and the cure of the heart. This would also kind of cleverly represent another conflict of her original form that we'll get to in just a minute, but needless to say, on top of her just generally fun and trollish personality, it made her a very interesting character as someone who is constantly switching between the two sides, rightfully making her one of the biggest elements viewers take away from this series. It's a character arc that we see a lot in shows, including with a certain Kamen Rider and his bird person. Yeah, looking back on it, I honestly can't believe I missed out on some of these obvious connections to my favorite character from O's, and in general, one of my favorite Kamen Rider characters ever. I mean, let's see here. We have Regina and Agri, two halves of a broken up pole. They both primarily have red in their color schemes, and one has a fire motif along with a normal form of a young child.
So, where am I, or rather, he's going with this?
Yeah, again, I do believe Yota Yamaguchi was more than a little inspired by the multicolored rider, resulting in his interpretation of Ankh, the deuterogonist of Oz, who in some ways became the actual most plot-significant character, for better and arguably for worse in the case of Precure. Okay, so for those who haven't seen it, Ankh was another one of the Greed, who actually set off a lot of the events of the story, and had circumstances been different, would have likely become one of the biggest antagonists of his show. However, thanks to the kindness of the title character, Eiji, he went through a character arc where he overcame his greed, and even sacrificed himself to save his friend and the world. Now, obviously, the parallels with Regina are nearly all right there. A former villain who set off the events of the show, and has a relationship with the main protagonist with slightly gay undertones. The only difference was the sacrifice that Mana vetoed. Though in that very moment, it really should have solidified Regina as worthy of becoming a Precure, as it was the ultimate act of selflessness that could have even overcome her father's gaslighting. Alas though, they just had to throw another one in. So, again in O's, there was a character called Lost Ankh, who was basically Ankh's main body that had developed a will of its own. It really didn't have that much of a character. In fact, it often acted like a child, since it was essentially a body without a brain, so basically and it was eventually defeated, allowing Ankh to become whole again. So, with all that in mind, they didn't really need Agri to complete the reference, and yet here we are.
And yeah, while I'm still very much in the camp that feels like this was Dokidoki's biggest misstep, I also can't deny that it did lead to some pretty strong developments in its own right.
After all, Princess Anja's inability to choose between completely giving in to her selfish desires to save just her father, or her selfless dedication to her people, literally tore her apart, only for her two halves to realize that they ultimately need each other, and one of them, who was supposed to completely represent selfishness, would repeat the princess's choice, with Regina again choosing between her father and the very living embodiment of selflessness, Mana. It's great symbolic storytelling that even tied into the final message of the series, in that both were two sides of the same coin who need to learn how to live with each other.
Before we get into the final bosses of the show, let's really ask the question, were these guys effective as antagonists for their show?
I mean, yeah, we've been praising them individually a lot throughout this video, but I think some of the main reasons Dokidoki is often criticized as a season is 1, the aforementioned failure to capitalize on a good thing with Regina, and 2, how their villains were overall pretty goofy and hard to take seriously at times. Sure, you could say the same about the Smile villains, but Joker more than easily made up for the difference, while Bel struggled to not look more pathetic than a certain Decepticon. Hell, even the intimidating-looking King Jikoshu got a little hard to take seriously when he really started to yell out for his daughter. Regina! However, much like Smile and even Happiness Charge, I don't mind these goofier moments as long as they tonally match well enough with the rest of the show. It's fine to joke around a little, as it even kind of highlights the more serious moments all the more.
Obviously, you should overdo it, or worse yet, disregard some of the more serious themes you established early on.
It's all about moderation, and while I do think overall seasons like Smile and Yes 5 handle it better, it still works out for me, and if anything, I'm still laughing at several of these clips I'm putting up, so they're doing something right. Moreover, even if they weren't a consistent threat, which yeah, I would have preferred much like with Joker, they at least maintain an important role for the antagonists of any narrative, acting as foils to the protagonists. As we just went over, Aubrey and Regina were the two most blatant examples of foils, in that they're supposed to highlight the positive qualities of the characters we follow the most in this show, which of course are the Precure. Even more so when the antagonists are based off of negative extremes like the 7 Deadly Sins. Starting off with Wrath again, Ira ended up highlighting Rika's ability to understand others, be they a friend like Mana, or even an enemy like Kim, by not giving in to some rightfully bitter feelings from the past, but instead standing by her ideals of helping others as a doctor. The scene of greed in Mammo very appropriately highlighted Alice's generosity in giving back to those who had provided for her, and more so. And for as little focus as he got, Leva ended up highlighting Makoto's desire to entertain others by being an idol, and not just enviously wanting to be seen as one. All of this was shown in their respective spotlight episodes during the second core of the series when they unlocked their greater powers by recognizing the vows of the Precure. Though I think Mana might have been a bit of a different case. I would say her villain foils were a combination of Bel, King Jikochu, and the Pro Jikochu, which does kind of work out, as by the end of the series, they all kind of overlap with each other, when Bel ate the remnants of the king to become the Pro Jikochu. Obviously, Mana was no sloth, and even though she sought a higher number 1 position like being a student council president, she would see that as a larger platform to help others, rather than just cozily sitting back and watching others work for her. Meanwhile, in contrast with the king, who represented pride being essentially based on the OG fallen angel Lucifer, she never really saw herself as a higher power, but rather a constant servant to others. Lastly, with the Pro Jikochu, he might have been yet another O's parallel, being a big purple guy who represented the 8th sin of despair, as he even had the same goal of trying to create an empty world all to himself, not realizing how truly worthless and sad a world like that would be.
誰もいない世界ではあなたは自己中でいられなくなる
Though, much like with Eiji, while confronting these 3 sins highlighted her good qualities, they also shined a light on the faults in her belief. By not taking a break or seeking any sort of self-gratification, Mana not only left herself open to exhaustion, but also made herself somewhat empty like the Pro Jikochu when she couldn't help people, and even left her in shock when they outright rejected it like with Regina.
Overall, I don't see the Selfish Kingdom as one of the most developed villain factions overall, like say Darkfall or even the Bad End Generals, but I also think narratively they might be one of the more effective ones of this franchise.
By representing the 7 or 8 deadly sins, they were able to highlight the bare virtues of the protagonists, and while some of them definitely had more character to them than others, the fact that everyone had their own selfish agendas did make for some interesting conflicting dynamics amongst the baddies. Not to mention, when they really went all in with some of these personality traits, they could legit be one of the funniest factions, especially when they had to work off each other and let those egos collide. Like, just imagine if these sort of scenes were to a Precure series 08. Well, the point is that I really do like the baddies of Dokidoki, both as a Kamen Rider O's fan, and as someone who appreciates antagonists who manage to bring out the best in the heroes of their story. While people should avoid completely giving in to sinful behavior, for these guys, or at the very least Regina, you can give in a little just for some fun, just don't play dodgeball with them is all.
Thank you for watching, and I hope you all have a safe and fun Halloween. You know, if we can actually get this out on time.
Next time, though, we'll probably restart the Futai reviews with Maxed Heart and some of the issues with that show, not just the villains.
And until next time, though, farewell for now, my friends, and, say, where did Uncle? Hey, those popsicles are for my niece!